Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you could kindly put on your headphones, you would be able to hear me. Otherwise, you think, why am I making these wild faces without saying anything? Okay. Right. Good afternoon again. My name is Kelapirthi Ramakrishna. I'm from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the last session of the day, at least in the Ocean Pavilion. And if I may say so, one of the more important sessions. We have the same session repeated as an official side event of the UNFCCC as well. And what we are trying to address here today is ocean across the three COPs, conferences of the parties, the three being obviously Biodiversity Convention, which already concluded in Cali, Colombia, and Baku, the UNFCCC COP, and Riyadh, the UNCCD COP. We are, of course, meeting at a time when the idea of a troika, the presidencies it started in United Arab Emirates and then to Baku and then Belém, and that will continue. But another important thing is in in Dubai, not only the executive heads of these three conventions, but also the presidents of the three conventions, the host countries, plus the G20 and others, have all joined to break down the silos and to see how we can make progress. So we thought doing this now is a good way to start to understand exactly what the connections between them are and how we can ensure that there is greater dialogue amongst the three, not only the convention secretariats, but the countries dealing with these three topics as we move forward. We have a terrific panel. I'm going to introduce all of them at once and then give them turn by turn, and then we have a series of questions for them as well. To my immediate left is Peter Demenakel. He is the president and director of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And to his left is Satya Tripathi, currently Secretary General of the Global Alliance for Sustainable Planet. And before that, he was Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And to his left is Margaret Linen, Director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography and Vice Chancellor for Marine Sciences in University of California, San Diego. And to her left is my old friend Cecilia, who's a Senior Director in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I was delighted to see her, but I was preparing myself that given the state of negotiations, she might not actually show up, but really glad that you are here. So what I'm going to do is ask a question and ask each of you to respond to that in about a couple of minutes, and then I'll go on to the next one, and then we will open it up for conversation. The first question, of course, is what role do you think ocean plays in each of these three Rio conventions? Peter, would you like to go first? Yes, you do.
That helps a lot. Can you hear me? That works great. I love this. I get all the thumbs up from everybody. It's my honor to be here with such a distinguished panel, and thank you, Rama, for the kind introduction. Welcome everyone to this afternoon session. And this idea of a blue thread running through the three COPs of climate, of biodiversity, of desertification. Each of these three main themes are very much linked to the ocean. As pretty much all of you know, because you're in the Ocean Pavilion, the ocean is the single largest regulator of climate on the planet. And so when we think about the ocean's role on climate, the ocean's role in biodiversity and in desertification. In terms of climate, as we all know, the ocean absorbs about a quarter to a third of the carbon dioxide emitted due to carbon emissions, and now 90% of heat. And I just want to call your attention to an op-ed that my colleague Gavin Schmidt of the NASA Goddard Institute published in today's New York Times about just how unusual this year has been. In fact, it defies our understanding in climate models to explain why the ocean is so warm. And it is engaging feedbacks that we're just beginning to learn about. When we think about the biodiversity angle, one of the programs that we had at the Oceanographic was to understand this hidden realm of the ocean called the mesopelagic, which is between 200 and 1,000 meters in the ocean. So it's the largest ecosystem on the planet, and we know so little about it. And so the COP meetings have really called attention to the importance of the mesopelagic, not only for biodiversity, but actually as a carbon pump that transports billions of tons of carbon to the deep ocean, where it is stored safely or stored securely for centuries to millennia. And then on desertification, the role of the ocean is the single largest source of interannual, year-to-year variations in extreme humidity or extreme rainfall and extreme drought. And as some of you may have seen in the news just this year, the intertropical convergence zone, the tropical rain belt that encircles the planet, has taken a marked shift northward just in this past year, again, very much linked to changes in ocean temperatures and the ability of the ocean to supercharge the atmosphere with moisture to deliver it in places that don't normally get such extreme rainfall and deny it in other places as well. And actually, Margaret's team has one of the world's best groups working in atmospheric rivers. So those are three ways in which there's this blue thread that runs between the three COPs, and I'll pass it off to my colleagues.
Thank you, Peter. I think, I'll speak more from a layperson's perspective because I don't pretend to be a scientist, because I'm not. But what I understand as an environmental activist are three things. The first is that there is a little understanding of what the ocean does and a little gratitude for what the ocean does. We know so little about the oceans. About 95% of the oceans are still unexplored. We're just finding out with great effort, the scientists are coming and telling us about what is happening to the oceans. Either it's increased heat, either it's the loss of the ability of the oceans to produce the oxygens. We should be grateful, depending on which study you believe. It could be 50%, it could be 70% of the oxygen that's produced comes from the oceans. The biodiversity, 10 million, up to 10 million species. And so every little thing we have everything to be grateful to the oceans about, including trade, the AMOC, which is almost about to collapse thanks to our monumental stupidity as a species. And one could go on and on and on. And then, so if you're talking about desertification, you rightly pointed out, El Nino, La Nina, they all have significant impact, how the sea surface temperature rises and falls periodically decides whether we'll have a bad rainfall season or a complete drought, or bushfires or forest fires. Look at the US, one of the worst victims of forest fires on the planet. Of course, there are the exception of Indonesia in 2015, which was much worse than the US. Otherwise, on an average, 5 million acres of forest burn down every year in the United States alone. So whether it's desertification, whether it's the complete collapse of biodiversity, and of course, climate change, one could, so it is all strung together. And the last point I want to make is that we really need to wake up and smell the coffee, because we are at a very bad place, and we keep pretending that we are helping the planet. We are not. The planet will help itself. It has helped itself for billions of years. We need to help ourselves, be very selfish. We need to help ourselves get over an existential threat that humanity has never experienced in its entire history, known or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you. We've talked a bit about the ocean and the blue thread that runs through climate. I'm going to give you a couple of examples for biodiversity and for desertification. So depending on which groups of microbes people count, do they count the viruses or not, the ocean is either 70 or 90% of the biodiversity on the planet. And people tend to think of this in terms of the diversity of big things that we can see, marine mammals, coral reefs, seagrass, etc. But those are a small part of the biodiversity. And one of the things that is a real focus for oceanography now is trying to understand the potential of change in the rest of the biodiversity. And this is really tough when you think about how removed most of it is from our ability to sample. But a development that really came out of genetics and biomedical approaches called, that has to do with our ability to identify organisms by their DNA, is currently being used in oceanography to be able to look easily at the biodiversity. So there are two techniques. One is called metabarcoding and one is called environmental DNA. Both of them rely on the fact that every organism in the ocean releases its DNA into the ocean. It either excretes DNA, or like fish that have mucus, this goes into the water, or they die and release DNA. And we now know that that DNA is stable in seawater for a couple of weeks. That means that you can sample the water rather than trying to catch organisms with various nets or go out and photograph them or listen to them acoustically and try to decipher who's who. This is really transforming marine biology and biological oceanography. What's more is that it's very easy to do this sampling. So we have available to us now a technique that can be used by ordinary citizens to help us sample in the coastal zone. And the development of autonomous vehicles that already exist to take samples out in the deep ocean for this, and within a couple of years we'll be able to actually analyze the samples on the vehicles. So now think about these in the same way that we have tools like the Argo or the various kinds of drifters that we rely on for being able to look at the physics of the ocean and its chemistry. The biology will now be revealed. This is so important for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has never been able to really get their grippers around how climate change is affecting the biodiversity of the ocean. With respect to desertification, Peter mentioned atmospheric rivers. Until probably about 15 years ago, very few people were aware of them. An atmospheric river is an oceanic feature, starts in the ocean, and it's a thin area, a zone of water vapor in the atmosphere. If you looked at it with a satellite, you'd see a bright line going across the ocean. And they arise in the tropics and move toward not only the temperate zones, but also into polar zones. One of these can carry as much water as 25 Mississippi rivers. I think that translates to something like 17 Amazons. And when they encounter continents, the water vapor is uplifted and results in rainfall. It can be very beneficial if you're in a drought. It can be devastating if that full power of water comes down. We now have the ability to predict these on a scale of 3 to 5 days. Is it going to hit me? How bad is it going to be? And when is it going to hit me? Because these are so powerful in controlling the amount of rainfall and flooding. For example, in my home state, California, 90% of the flooding is due to atmospheric rivers, and half of the rainfall is due to atmospheric rivers. These are controlling, because they affect all continents, they're controlling much of the extreme flooding and extreme desertification that we see. So it's another blue thread, this time an atmospheric blue thread, that goes through the Convention on Desertification.
Wow. Thank you very much. It's really a great honor to join this panel of really esteemed scientists and esteemed activists and my former colleague at UNEP. I come here from the intergovernmental processes and an understanding of the need to look at the three conventions and now increasingly the voice demanding that more synergy is required between the three Rio Conventions. I am a child of the Rio Conventions, and I always say my professional life began in '92 when I was working with Professor Wangari Maathai as her intern, and watching her as she went to Rio, and subsequently that supporting the processes through the interim intergovernmental processes of the three Rio Conventions, and now sitting at UNFCCC, watching our executive secretaries talking to each other and saying synergies are inevitable. I think the ocean is evidently the epitome of a demonstration of what the polycrisis, whether it's climate, whether it's pollution, or the crisis of biodiversity loss, is demonstrated. And I think, Professor, you've really demonstrated that in your elaboration of science, whether you're talking about viruses or whether you're talking about the loss of coral reefs and other ecosystem services that the ocean offers. At UNGAR, is it a month ago or 2 months ago, the three presidents, the president of COP30, the president of COP29, and COP28 came together, and they coined this very interesting terminology, and they're talking about the Rio Trio. And I think for me, the Rio Trio is not just a concept of looking at triplets, but it's a concept of looking at how we can secure the planet, but also the people, by ensuring that we address these three crises in a much more integrated manner, and also provide the leadership at the very highest level to ensure that this happens. The global stocktake, which we concluded at COP28, was also the space where, as you know, the UNFCCC has a mandate to undertake and organize the dialogue on oceans and climate. And the ocean and climate community and the parties, as well as non-party stakeholders, actually brought this to bear and said we cannot actually conclude the global stocktake without bringing the issue of the interlinkages between the ocean, the biodiversity, looking not only at conservation, but also issues of protection of ecosystems, and ensuring that the outcome of the global stocktake and the first assessment, ensuring that there is action across mitigation, adaptation, and also means of implementation that addresses these linkages. And for me, as we convene here in Baku, it will be interesting to see, and the presidency here has been very, very keen to see how they can learn from the best practices and the lessons. And they are looking at the Caspian Sea as a space where they can learn and borrow some of the science that you've been undertaking, some of the policies that have been emerging, some of the best practices in terms of securing different water bodies and different water systems. So for me, this is an emerging area also, as we talk about synergy, whether it's land-based activities and the pollution that finds its way into the oceans, or we are talking about life underwater and a good linkage to the SDGs, which we are also saying that we are miles back, behind in terms of implementing. And now again, what progress will we be making here in Baku that allows us to move to Belém with a process that ensures that the Rio Trio really gives birth to something that fundamentally will allow us to have NDCs that are economy-wide, because that's what we'll be looking at in Belém, and that the ocean becomes part of that economy-wide system that can provide us with mitigation and adaptation solutions that our cities, our governments, our communities can bring to bear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for that. And the next question is to both Cecilia and to Satya. And the following question for Margaret and Peter. Cecilia, you highlighted very well the fact that the leadership in the conventions and the countries that host these COPs is there now to talk to each other and to build the synergies needed. And the UNFCCC, as you know, launched this Ocean Climate Dialogue, and there is a similar attempt in the Biodiversity Convention to think about how to incorporate ocean matters, not just under the Law of the Sea Convention and the new High Seas Treaty, but as Biodiversity Convention. So what do you see that you need from the ocean community to really build on these synergies? Obviously, capacity development for the countries that don't know anything about it is clearly one point of it, but there are others as well. Why don't you go first, and then I'll ask Satya next to follow on you.
As I was coming here, I was wondering, I saw this terminology, the blue thread.
Yeah.
That blue thread that's passing, that's going through the three conventions. And I was trying to imagine, I come from Kenya, and it's and we have an ocean. And one of the things I always wonder, it's the poly crisis for me. It's first an understanding by policymakers that these three issues are interconnected. We are still at a national level designing policies that are fragmented, that are not speaking to each other. We are also in a system, here we will be talking about finance, and it's the same problem we are having, that even the finance mechanisms that exist see each ecosystem or each issue, whether it's biodiversity, as separate. So moving towards a more integrated approach, both in terms of policy making, but also in terms of the financing mechanisms we have, because communities living adjacent to oceans and depending on oceans don't see these things as different. They are depending on the ocean for food, they are depending on the ocean for various other resources, and they do not see that, that fragmentation or that silo that exists in our minds even when we are negotiating. When negotiators come to the climate space, at times they're the same negotiators who will be leaving here and going to Riyadh, right. To negotiate the desertification and drought. And a lot of times they will forget the decision and the text they were negotiating here and start drafting a new text, which is basically for that. We came from Kunming. It's the same thing, the Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework coming from Kali. We need to start making sure that thread does not have dye. There's no white dye that separates, and that it's a continuous blue line, and therefore have a much more integrated process in terms of decision making, the way we build partnerships, and the way we support our communities, whether it's through finance capacity or any other means of implementation.
Right. Satya.
Same question?
Yes, same.
Okay, wonderful. I have just two observations to make. I, as an environmental economist, I have always been fascinated by Richard Thaler, the behavioral economist Nobel laureate. His mental accounting, the bounded rationality. He was talking about all money being fungible, no matter how many piggy banks or how many envelopes you put them in, and you are expending maybe 40% credit interest for your credit card debt, while you are earning 2% in your certificate deposits or your fixed deposits, as they call it in some countries, and you want to keep it there. Oh, that's my fixed deposit, while you are completely depleting your wealth. That's exactly what we are doing with nature. We put everything, and thank you, Cecilia, for making that point. We do this mental accounting, so that's okay. And this is not okay. Tiny things here and there, whereas Mother Nature is literally disappearing in front of our eyes, or what we call the web of life in more scientific terms. So that's the first part. The second is that there's a lot of emphasis on changing finance, but not enough on financing change. So we are obsessed with taxonomy, reports and studies and what kind of reporting mechanisms in the principles of responsible banking, principles of responsible investment, principles of responsible insurance, and all net zero asset owners alliance. The supply side conversation is confounding. There is little happening on the demand side. We need to get to the grassroots, work with people at the bottom of the pyramid, create stakeholder coalitions that are, of a magnitude never seen before, because a problem created by 8 billion people is not going to be solved by a few governments and a few corporations. Yes, regulation helps. Yes, corporate greed going away certainly helps. But we need to change behavior, and that needs all of us in this room and beyond to become activists. Whether it's in our office, whether it's in our workspaces, whether it's in the fields, agricultural fields, or in the oceans. We are working with 250,000 fishermen. I was just explaining to Peter the kind of scale. They go out to sea every day. When they put the nets out, they pick up 40% plastic. Then they spend the next day trying to throw that plastic back into the oceans. So we're trying to build a coalition of buyers. If they are willing to pay the same price as they're paying for wholesale price for fish, then all that plastic can actually come ashore. And as you keep doing it with 250,000 fishermen, it will completely clean up the oceans, at least in the territorial waters. And this is something replicable. There are so many ideas where you can actually do it at scale and you can change the paradigm. And so that's where we need to focus while spending enough time on the science, and the science actually is illuminating because it tells us where to look and what to be worried about. I'm not suggesting for a second that we should let go of that. I mean, that is so important because science has actually held that mirror to our dumb minds, that we refuse to see the truth for what it is. Science has actually been that powerful mirror over the last 3 decades, even as politicians obfuscate and hedge their bets and companies keep lying to us. It is science that has kept going. So science is the most important thing, but we also need to get to the bottom of the pyramid to get people to act. Thank you.
Thank you, Satya. The next question is to Margaret and to Peter. You two were at the helm of your respective institutions, and you two decided with other partners to create this ocean pavilion, starting with Sharm el-Sheikh. And the reason you did that was because you felt that ocean is not factoring in well in climate convention to start with, and extends to other things as well. What do you think is missing, in terms of the knowledge base that would help first the secretariats and of course broadly the member countries to take this, as Satya pointed out, in all of its various values that it gives to the humanity? Margaret, would you like to go first?
Well, I think that the key was the last few words you said, the value for humanity. Because we must be able to tell the story not just of what happens, but the implications of that for people. Because as you said, the ocean will be there. It may be a different ocean, but will we be there? And I think that that is a key. And I think the good news is that the scientists at our institutions now recognize that they need to be able to take that extra step to say, and the implication of this is this. Because I think that it's not, being able to translate the science to another aspect of science is not helpful to the negotiators. I think the other thing is that we need to be able to tell our neighbors and our families about this, because even if there are politicians that are more interested in just talking to each other, if their constituents are saying, we need help, you need to help us solve the problem of sea level rise, or of the lack of fish, or of the rainfall that is devastating us, they will pay attention to their constituents.
Peter?
Yeah, so one of the, as I was thinking about your question, Rama, it struck me that the biggest and most obvious answer is such a hopeful one, which is the fact that we are all gathered in this room today in the Ocean Pavilion. The Ocean Pavilion didn't exist 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Margaret and I and the other partners of the pavilion who are here today, in establishing the Ocean Pavilion, brought to the COPs this community of people who are concerned about the ocean and who can bring their talents to bear, not only for their respective institutions that are all excellent in their own ways, but also across this divide of science and policy and governance to really engage all of the world. As Margaret said, I think much of what happens in scientific institutions stays in scientific institutions or within that pillar of knowledge. We're way beyond that as a people right now. As a globe, we really need to be not only disseminating the knowledge that we have to people who can help turn this to make a difference, like our two distinguished colleagues here, but also to find a way to use this knowledge to inform action. And I think this is certainly something that we're leaning into at the Woods Hole Oceanographic, which is not only focusing on the fundamental science that underpins all these things that we've talked about, but also what are the use-inspired scientific objectives that we can explore that can really help move the ball forward. So for example, on the ocean's role on climate, this use-inspired knowledge creation is saving hundreds of millions to even billions of lives, because now we can actually forecast the ENSO state 6 to 9 months. This is El Nino Southern Oscillation, 6 to 9 months into the future. And that basically allows policymakers, allows governments to plan so that they can plan for extreme rainfall or extreme drought or extreme temperature swings. That kind of forecasting ability is purely a science and engineering accomplishment, but where it really made a difference was how this was implemented by governments, by people, by policymakers. So to me, the real gap to be closed here is one of bringing these diverse communities together toward a common objective, toward a North Star objective, which is something that really gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you, Peter. I remember being in Lisbon at the UN Ocean Conference too, and the UN Secretary General was at the beach meeting with a number of youth activists. He said something almost with tears in his eyes, that he said he's apologizing to the youth that were there, basically saying that we failed, my generation failed in doing what is right by you in terms of doing the things that were within our capacity, but we just did not. All four of you are steeped in your respective institutions at the top levels. Again, going back to what you said, Peter, what we know in the scientific institutions, keeping it within the scientific institutions. But the question to all four of you is this: what is it that you think you could learn from civil society, ordinary citizens, youth, that would help you in formulating what needs to be done moving forward? You can start any which way you like. Yeah.
Yeah, I spent a couple of years, 10 years, as the head of UNEP in South Africa. And one of the things that I was doing is working very closely with the young people and with the youth. And during the World Environment Day, I would engage and work with young people, would go to Durban or would be in Cape Town or Port Elizabeth. Basically, coming together and starting campaigns on plastic, on reducing plastic pollution and plastic waste in the oceans. And one of the things I really learned from the young people is sometimes they really get engaged and worried also about what the future holds for them. And when you keep them in a group, and I'd do some pieces of art with them, and I'd say, just tell me what you imagine as the biggest challenge on environment. And they'd draw all these kind of images, and you'd see that at the end of the day, there is a level of worry of where the future, what the future holds for them. And basically, this is why the Secretary General was apologizing, because we have a responsibility as policymakers, as negotiators. And as I was saying, we tend to fragment, we tend to look at things individually. I've seen it here. Even where negotiators have a pet item on the agenda, they will hold so strongly on it and forget the rest of the agenda, and they're ready to let the whole agenda collapse. And I think we need to take responsibility. And it also takes me back to working with city mayors. And today, the science is very clear. Evidence is there that extreme weather is really causing destruction. But I remember working with city mayors, and once would ask me, oh, when is the sea level going to rise in a way that 500 meters or 100 meters of my land in my city, in my coastal city, will be gone? We cannot no longer ask those questions. So there's a sense of urgency, there is a sense of responsibility, and there's a sense where we must provide leadership to ensure that the future generations and the younger people find something for them that they can use, that they can benefit from, and that they can leave. And as you said, we may not be there. We may not be there. The ocean will be there. But the planet and the people need to live together in harmony and in unison. Yeah.
The things that I hear in my country are very much like what you're hearing in your country. And it's a sense of, we believe that you have answers for us. We want you to make sure that who govern and who can help, who have the action tools for us, we want to make sure that they listen to you. We need you to have that conversation and to be leaders in conveying that message. And then, like you, I also hear this sense of, I believe now, I see the change, whether it's talking to young people or whether it's talking to old people. I don't see, yes, there are a few deniers, but they're the minority now, for sure. And this sense of frustration and, in some cases, despair. And they always ask me if I'm optimistic or if I'm pessimistic. And I look at them and I say, I'm optimistic because of you. Now, I have the great gift of being able to work at a university, so I see a lot of young people. And I know the skills that they have and the talents that they have. In fact, all of the faculty say, oh, I'm so glad I'm not competing with them because they're so good. And I think that they are really searching for, again, that leadership that will allow them to be active, to be the change makers, the empowerment of them to be able to do that. And I think that it's a lesson for all of us to make sure that we activate them, as well as, the older experts that are around.
Thank you, Margaret. I have the privilege of being the chancellor of a university back in India. It's the world's largest academic institution for indigenous children, with 40,000 students from very little to postdoc, and doctors and engineers and designers and whatever you can think of, all educated for free. Accommodation, food, education, everything for free. Why do we do this? It's a calling. It's getting the best learning to the stewards of the planet. They come from deep within the forest. When they come, they don't even speak a language. We run a language lab till they get to class 5. It's called the Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences. So whenever I get there, I'm the chancellor, I'm not the vice chancellor. I don't run the place, but I keep oversight. So I make it a point to talk to, sometimes the congregations I address has about 20,000 students in the stadium, as many as it can hold. And I tell them, it is in your power to change the world in every possible way you imagine. And I tell them what's wrong with us, the adults, and I tell them that you are the first generation that's really seeing the horrible impacts of climate change. You are also possibly the last generation that can do something about it. So stand up for what you believe in, Tell your politicians, tell your policymakers, and do not be shy, do not be soft, because we are at a very bad time in the history of the planet, and especially the history of humanity. That's the first thing. The second is that, young people, we work with a lot of young people. The organization that I head, the Global Alliance for a Sustainable Planet, has about 350 member organizations, many intergovernmental organizations, including the UN, and we also have financial institutions. The biggest one is $800 billion, Federated Hermes. And then we have a lot of them, very smart young people that have already done stuff that is extraordinary by any standards. At their age, I didn't know if I was coming or going. These people have had an imagination, has an idea, and they have actually made it happen. So we are taking them to scale. We're about to announce in the next 2 months the world's largest green economy accelerator to produce 10 million green jobs in the next 5 years to benefit oceans and land and skies. We'll announce it in 2-3 months. But you'll be surprised to see 80% of the people the entrepreneurs that are part of that are all very young people in their late 20s or their early 30s and extraordinary climate champions. So if you ask me if I believe in young people, hell I do, and with all my heart. Thank you.
I think we should just stop there. You've all covered some topics I think I probably might have touched on, but one topic that perhaps hasn't been raised so fully was really emphasized to me at lunch today. And it was an answer to a question, what do you think would be a model for success for Belém for next year? What would you call a successful outcome? And one thing I see in this room, and certainly up on this dice here, is there's no question, everyone in this room, everyone listening to us, that we're all committed. There's no question that we understand the severity of the challenges ahead. And there's no question, I'll speak for my institution, that we are fundamentally committed to developing the knowledge that's going to guide actions forward. What we're not doing, what I think we must do, is have this cross-sectoral engagement that brings along the larger society on this journey, because they're not going to come kicking and screaming. They're going to come because they see the value to their bottom line, whatever it is, whether it's the next generation, whether it's their company. We need to be able to bring them along as well. And I see that as really the challenge of us collectively moving forward, which is how can we reach across the aisle? How can we engage groups that don't understand what we understand, but what we know to be true? And a portion of my time these days is actually reaching out to these other organizations, these industries, these other groups, to try to find where are the areas of common ground that will get us to the outcome that you just mentioned. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We have had some really terrific interventions and responses to, a few questions that I had. Now, of course, it's your turn to ask them questions. I would like you to keep the questions very brief, and if you can also name who you're going to ask, who you would like to answer that question, that would be helpful. Basically, what we talked about so far were the Paris Agreement and the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and of course the land degradation neutrality. They all have that connecting link with ocean, and negotiators talk about it all the time. And again, those of you, many of you I see with SDG pins, and 13, 14, 15. Climate, water, ocean, and land. There is also a common theme running through them. As Cecilia said, we have begun the process. There's a lot of conversation, but that would result in what we would like to see happen if there are concrete initiatives that are advanced both by countries and by people like us. So with that, the floor is open. Who would like to go first? Yes, right here. Please keep the question short and to address it to a particular panelist. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Declan Gallagher. I'm a student from Indiana University. I'm here at COP studying the Caspian Sea. And so since Cecilia, you mentioned the Caspian Sea and the importance of that body of water, I know that the ocean and the Caspian Sea, they're very different, both biologically, biodiversity-wise. But how can we apply what we've learned about the ocean to other bodies of water like the Caspian Sea?
I'm going to actually pass this to a real expert on the Caspian Sea, Vladimir Ryabinin, former executive director of IOC.
Thank you very much, Margaret. You know, Caspian Sea is indeed suffering from sea level rise, now from sea level fall, and the pace of this fall is actually, I would say, an order of magnitude larger than sea level rise that we know on the planet. And it is still not entirely clear what is happening, but the consequences are indeed in the domain of desertification, in the domain of climate, in the domain of biodiversity. They're nearly everywhere. Indeed, storm surges became stronger and more devastating when sea level was rising, and then there is a huge retreat of land with social issues. So an ocean is behind that, because what we understand now is that the reason for this significant regional climate change in the Caspian Sea is related to anomalies that exist in the ocean, in other parts of the global ocean. So this brings me back to the one important statement that was made by our common friend Craig McLean, acting scientist for National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration of NOAA. He said, if we wish to predict weather for 3 days, thank meteorologists. If we wish to predict weather for 5 days and longer, thank an oceanographer. So ocean is able to explain what is happening in this particular. Thank you very much, Margaret, for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Vladimir. Next question, please. Elisa. No, we can't hear you.
Hi, I think this question's for Cecilia, but it could be anybody who has an idea. Within the three instruments that you're talking about, are there specific structures, scientific, technical bodies that could be linked up among the three? Or what formal working modes could allow the ocean to be talked about together rather than separately in each of those three frameworks?
No, you're right. Each of them have a SUBSTA. They all call them SUBSTA, the subsidiary body for science, technology. Yeah, each of those, all of them have subsidiary bodies which are responsible for science. And this is really where the three conventions could actually converge. It's not happening, because I look after the subsidiary body and the governing bodies of the UNFCCC formally across the three bodies, but I know that the scientists, whether you go to GCOS or other platforms, the scientists are talking to each other. But in the intergovernmental multilateral process, they're still seen as separate bodies, and we need to do a little bit more. We can't talk synergy and just talk about it at an abstract level. We need to get our hands into the bodies and ensure that we are working together. So yes, the mechanisms exist independently, but there is no mandate from parties. We'd need the parties to give us that mandate to ask us to work together, even across the scientific bodies.
Any other questions? You know, this is a question for, it starts with Cecilia, but Satya and others can answer this as well. You know, we have basically the same membership of the United Nations. Those are the same countries that negotiate each of these agreements. But why is there such a resistance to reaching across the different convention processes to talk with each other. I mean, this is not an unfair question, and I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, but, maybe Satya can talk about this better than I, but the thing is, it just is baffling. I mean, Lisa's question is not that she doesn't know that there are subsidiary bodies, but why are they not talking to each other? And why do we have to have a meeting here that says, ocean across these conventions? Satya.
I think it's complete lack of honesty, and we are all hedging, like we are. So until it all comes unravels, we'll keep hedging. Countries were promised $100 billion by 2020, that's the Paris Agreement, right? And at that time, it was very clear what climate finance is. Everybody understood in the room what climate finance is. OECD just came up with a report 3 months ago saying, oh, it's almost exceeding $100 billion now because the businesses that invest in other countries is also climate finance. Really? Is that what was discussed in 2015? So when you just completely, fudge everything and you have no integrity in whatever you are saying, then it's very difficult, And now, if you look at the emissions gap report that just came out 5 days ago, if you look at the 2018 emissions gap report, whatever we said then, and I used to be part of UNEP then, so I know because I was part of the deliberations, you need to reduce 43% by 2030. We're still exactly the same place. Now we're saying, 57% by 2035. We just moved the goalpost. Much worse. We've done nothing. So we really need to understand the problem for what it is. How consequential, like Churchill used to say during Second World War at a certain time, he said, we're entering the period of consequences. So every decision has a consequence now. We keep telling we can stay under 1.5 degrees. No, we can't. We're lying if we say that. We've already breached it. Last year there were multiple times it shot past that. 25% of locations on Earth will feel it by 2027. That's what scientists are telling us. And then, of course, it will become the new steady state. We can possibly stay under 2 degrees, but first, acceptance that we have a serious problem. We all need to own up to our part in the problem and see what we can do together. Second, focus on action. Because without action, we can keep talking about standards and processes. It's not going to get us anywhere. We need results of the consequential kind that can then be replicated at scale across the planet. UNFCCC is here to help. They have all kinds of hubs. If you really care, they have all kinds of acceleration. It's a treaty body. So, of course, they are not UNEP or UNDP or anything. So I understand their constraints. I was part of the team just a little while ago. But within their limitations and constraints, they are trying very hard to excite people, to bring people together so that people can really do something. So I think that's where it matters, and we need to find, and I keep telling this, we're actually in the process of setting up something called the World Nature Guarantee Facility, and our goal is to produce $1 trillion in investments in nature in the next 15 years. Sounds outlandish, but I can tell you I have been part of these things. We have orchestrated similar things in the past. I was just telling Peter before we started, we started helping a program in the state of Andhra Pradesh in India, a natural farming program, which was a boutique program when we met them in 2017. Now it is 1 million women farmers have converted to natural farming. The world's largest agroecology-based farming program. No synthetic chemicals, no pesticides. Their incomes have gone up by 50%. Yield has gone up by 11%, all validated by a study leader of a study orchestrated by the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, somebody who's a Nobel laureate, whose credibility is very well established. He's the father of TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. Pawan Sukhdev was the study leader, and he's a Tyler Prize laureate as well. So, so it is possible. And now the same master farmers, as we call them farmer scientists, they're going across the planet. They were just in Zimbabwe, training master trainers there. So it is possible, but we need to focus on action.
I think the basic message that I take away from all this is, well, we are creatures of the instruments that we adopted and are bound by the rules and regulations containing therein. I remember Kofi Annan saying very well that we are in a new century, but we are bound by rules that we agreed in the previous century. We need to adapt, and we are not doing that. But there are small incremental changes, important changes, but they are not at the speed that we want them to be. And the best way forward is really, riffing on what Satya had said, is getting those solutions, getting those actions from the bottom up. Then the real change will come about. We can hope to see that, and we hope these meetings help us in getting the word out to people that listen and then follow. Unless any of the panelists have any final words to offer, we can bring this to. You want to say something? No? All right. So, please, what? You want to ask a question? Can you keep it very short and yeah?
Torsten Tanner, scientist from Geomar in Germany. We've been talking about the ocean, importance of ocean, and how we can link that across 3 conventions. We know that the ocean touches many UN agencies, and in nation it touches many different ministries. Would it be timely and wise to go for an ocean convention, or will that be just another layer of bureaucracy? So I think Cecilia maybe could answer this question.
Yeah, it depends on who you ask this question. I think if we're really truthful and honest to ourselves, there is no need for another convention. We are here discussing the interrelationship, the interlinkages, the synergies. And I think if we continue towards that integrated approach in terms of looking at ecosystems, I think that will serve us better. We just, the BBNJ is the last baby treaty that we have now. And I believe that if we did an assessment and a mapping, even under the UN Oceans, we have a platform called the UN Oceans, it may not be necessary to have a new convention on oceans. Let's look for the synergies and strengthen those. But as I said, it depends on who you ask, because so the conventions are born by parties. The conventions are born by interests, national interests brought into the international cooperation platform. But if you ask me now, I don't think it's necessary. Thanks.
Thank you, Cecilia, for that. And I think that's a broader question, a bigger question, not necessarily about having a ocean convention. We do have a Law of the Sea treaty, but there are lots of other aspects to it, and it could be a topic for at least another full hour of session. Before I ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, I just want to tell you that we have the same session on the 20th as an official side event of UNFCCC, and you will see some of these panelists and also others joining in that. So we will have a longer time to continue these discussions. But for now, I want you to join me in thanking our panelists with a big round of applause.